At a heated congressional hearing on voting rights and immigration, Pam Bondi told Jasmine Crockett to go back to Africa, in front of cameras, in front of the nation. Millions witnessed raw racism unfold live. But what Jasmine said in response didn't just silence the room, it shook the country. Her calm defiance sparked protests, national headlines, and a moment now compared to Rosa Parks. What made this response so powerful, and why is the whole nation still talking about it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blistering glare of congressional spotlights, the chamber felt more like a war room than a hearing. Hearing Room 6B had been retrofitted for high stakes. Microphones calibrated, extra press rows installed, and security doubled at the door. The walls vibrated not with sound, but with pressure, centuries of tension ready to ignite. Pam Bondi sat poised in her tailored ivory suit, her smile sharp as broken glass. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett was a picture of composed defiance. Midnight blue blazer, shoulders back, jaw locked in restrained fury. Between them, the distance wasn't physical. It was ideological, racial, generational, a battlefield carved by history and held together by barely restrained civility. The moderator's voice cracked through the static. This hearing will address federal protections for voting rights, irregularities in ballot access, and broader implications for national unity. The moment the gavel dropped, the tension surged. C-SPAN, MSNBC, Fox, all broadcasting live, their lower thirds screaming with keywords. Election integrity showdown, Twitter hashtags trended before anyone spoke. Bondi and Crockett, voting rights, this is America. Outside the chamber, demonstrators clashed. Flags waved, fists pumped, chants echoed. Inside, the silence was louder than any protest. Every blink, every breath, every flicker of expression was fodder for analysis. Crockett didn't glance at the cameras. She knew exactly where they were. For Jasmine, this wasn't just politics, it was personal. She had grown up watching her parents stand in lines that stretched blocks just to vote, seen polling places vanish overnight, watched rights negotiated like poker chips on the hill. Now she was here, not to plead, but to confront. Yet even in her power, she could feel the invisible weight pressing down. The coded looks, the barely concealed smirks, the knowledge that for women like her, one misstep becomes a headline, one raised voice a scandal. But Jasmine didn't shake. She sharpened. And across the room, Pam Bondi saw it too, something she couldn't bend or bait. That was the energy. Not two women debating policy, but two Americas clashing in real time, and the entire country holding its breath. Then came the first strike, quiet, calculated, and wrapped in the kind of polished civility that makes cruelty harder to spot. Pam Bondi adjusted her posture just slightly, as if preparing to deliver something measured and important, though her smile curled with quiet condescension. "Let's be honest," she began, her voice a blend of courtroom composure and Sunday morning smugness. "What's really threatening our democracy today isn't voter suppression, it's voter abuse. Abuse of the system, abuse of the process, abuse by people who have no right stepping into a voting booth." Her eyes scanned the room, but her words were pointed. "We cannot allow undocumented immigrants or unverified voters to hijack elections, and yet every year we're asked to loosen the rules, to trust more, to question less." She let the sentence hang in the air like a trap, baiting, simmering, dressed in faux logic. "We need stronger laws, not more loopholes for those who think voting is a right handed out like candy." There it was, the trigger behind the calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable was sharpened to cut without drawing immediate blood. The cruelty was buried in the calmness, an attack delivered like a gift. Pam's gaze flicked intentionally toward Jasmine, just for a second. Enough for everyone to notice. Enough to send a message. Then she added in that same sweet, steel-laced tone, "This country was built on accountability. And frankly, I'm tired of seeing it chipped away by people who scream racism whenever we ask for ID." Laughter, not loud but present, rose from a few corners of the chamber. Jasmine sat still, her spine straight, eyes forward. The smirk on Pam's face widened, sensing a reaction that hadn't come yet. And still, Bondi pressed. You can't build a strong house on soft rules. Integrity means saying no. No to lawlessness, no to chaos, no to bending standards for the sake of someone's feelings. She paused dramatically, like an actress waiting for applause that never quite arrived. And if we start confusing compassion with compliance, we don't just lose elections, we lose the foundation of this republic. She wasn't talking about systems anymore. She was talking about people, about who deserved to belong, who deserved to decide, and who should be pushed quietly to the margins. And just when it seemed like Pam Bondi might stop, she went in deeper, with a smile and a voice full of fake concern. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry, but her words were sharp, clear, and designed to hurt without sounding cruel. You know what's really going on here, she said. These days, it's not about good policy. It's about who can play the victim the loudest. She paused, letting the sentence hang like smoke in the air. Then she added slowly, some politicians, let's be honest, especially the ones who come from so-called oppressed groups, have figured out it's easier to get attention by talking about racism than by doing real work. Her tone was smooth, but her message was brutal. She went on like she was giving the country some bold truth. They don't want unity, they want headlines. They don't want progress, they want pity. And anytime someone disagrees with them, they cry racism, as if that ends the conversation. The way she spoke, it was clear who she was talking about. She didn't say Jasmine's name, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. Her words weren't just general comments, they were aimed like arrows. It was a cheap shot dressed up like a thoughtful opinion, and it hit hard. Then the room broke into applause. Loud, rude, confident. The conservative side clapped like they'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Some of them even laughed. A few leaned back in their chairs with smirks, proud of the moment like they just won something. It wasn't just support, it was celebration. And all of it was being broadcast live on national TV. People all across the country were watching as a woman of color was called a fraud in the most polite, professional way possible. That's when the camera turned to Jasmine Crockett. Her face didn't move. She didn't blink. But her eyes, sharp, calm, full of fire, said everything. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't rattled. She was ready, because this wasn't new to her. She had heard versions of this her whole life, that she was only successful because of her skin color, that she didn't earn her place, that she was playing the race card, and now here it was again, on the record, on live TV, and no one was stopping it. What hurt most wasn't the insult itself. It was that no one objected. Not the moderator, not the committee, not the people in power who claimed to care about fairness. That silence said, "We're okay with this." And Jasmine heard it loud and clear. She wasn't just under attack, she was being dismissed, erased, made into a stereotype. But she didn't speak yet. Not out of fear, but out of control. Because she knew her next words had to cut deeper than any insult, and she would deliver them like truth sharpened to a blade. But Jasmine had heard enough, and now it was her turn to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the table. What she did was more powerful. She leaned in just a little, her voice steady and low, like someone laying bricks with bare hands. "Let's stop dancing around the truth," she began. "The problem isn't voters trying to cheat the system. The problem is the system cheating the voters." A hush fell over the room. She wasn't shouting, but every word hit hard. "Let's talk about Georgia," she continued, eyes sweeping across the panel. From 2012 to 2020, more than 200 polling places were shut down, mostly in black neighborhoods. That's not an accident. That's a plan. And it worked. It caused confusion. It forced people to drive miles just to cast a ballot. It made voting a burden instead of a right. She shifted gears without breaking pace. "In Texas," she said, "you can vote early, but only if you can find a drop box. In Harris County, where over 4 million people live, officials closed all but one single drop-off location. One, for millions." She looked directly at the chairman. "Meanwhile, counties with less than 100,000 residents got to keep theirs. Explain that to me like it's about fairness." Her tone was clear, grounded in fact, but underneath it was a quiet fire, the kind that builds, not burns. And in Florida, she went on, they passed a law making it illegal to hand out water or snacks to people waiting in line, lines that stretch hours in low-income communities. So let me ask you, is that about election integrity? Or is it about making people give up before they even get inside? Her eyes swept across the room again, locking briefly on the cameras. You call that protecting democracy. I call it selective silence. You build a wall around the vote, then act surprised when people stop knocking. Her voice didn't shake. It cut. You say it's about preventing fraud, but the fraud isn't coming from the streets. It's coming from inside the law. She paused, letting that truth settle. These laws, these rules, these sudden restrictions, they're not protecting anything. They're punishing people. And the people they punish always look the same. They live in the same zip codes. They work 2 jobs, take 2 buses, stand in line with tired feet and tired hope. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words only got heavier. This isn't about ID. It's not about rules. It's about fear. Fear of what happens when too many people, black people, brown people, poor people, start voting for change instead of waiting for permission. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands folded in front of her, calm but unmovable. Let's stop pretending this is complicated, she said. It's simple. You change the rules to keep the same people in power. You shift polling places, close early voting sites, limit mail-in ballots, then blame the voters for not showing up. Her voice lowered even more. And when they do show up, when they do vote in record numbers, like they did in 2020, you call it suspicious. You call it chaos. You call it fraud. But maybe what scares you most is that it worked. No one said a word. Not yet. Jasmine wasn't just challenging policy. She was exposing intent. And she was doing it with data, with lived truth, with the kind of focus that made it impossible to look away. Her presence didn't just fill the room, it called it out, line by line, lie by lie. The silence that followed Jasmine's statement wasn't empty. It was loaded, tense, dangerous, and Pam Bondi seized it like a weapon. She didn't wait for a question or a cue. She leaned forward with rehearsed urgency, her voice colder now, more clipped, like she'd been holding her breath for the right moment to strike. See? She said, gesturing toward Jasmine with one hand, the other gripping the table like she needed to anchor herself. This is exactly what I've been talking about. This kind of rhetoric, this kind of extremism, it's reckless. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp, cutting through the room like glass under pressure. She's not here to fix the system, Pam declared, eyes narrowing. She's here to dismantle it, to inflame, not inform, to push a radical agenda that paints every law as oppression and every disagreement as racism. The words poured out fast but with control, the kind of control meant to sound like clarity, when really it was calculated distortion. Let's call it what it is, she said. This isn't public service. It's provocation. It's theater. She turned slightly to address the room, voice rising just enough to stir the energy in her corner. And when you encourage people to distrust every institution, to defy every rule, you don't strengthen democracy. You burn it down. A few quiet claps emerged from behind her. The camera cut to Jasmine, but Pam wasn't done. We're not dealing with a leader, she said, almost smirking now. We're dealing with an activist in a suit. It was personal, it was brutal, and it was calculated to flip the story, to make Jasmine the threat instead of the voice of reason, to turn her calm into danger, her truth into chaos. Bondi knew exactly what she was doing, not arguing policy, but framing perception. She was painting Jasmine as unstable, unpredictable, even dangerous, not because of what she'd said, but because of what she represented. And in that moment, every ounce of Jasmine's restraint became an act of resistance. Because to answer that kind of attack with anger would prove Bondi right. And Jasmine knew better than to let someone else write her story. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself or raise her voice to match the accusation. Instead, she did something far more disarming. She smiled. Not a forced smile, not a political smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from someone who has already survived worse. The kind that says, I've heard this before, and I'm still here. Then she leaned forward just slightly, voice calm but laced with something deeper, conviction forged in fire. "You call me extreme?" she said, her eyes locked on Pam Bondi. "I'm not extreme. I'm asking to be treated fairly. I'm asking for the same basic rights that my ancestors were beaten, jailed, and killed for even daring to believe they deserved." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rush. Every word was carefully placed, like stone on stone, building something unshakable. "You call that radical?" she continued. "I call it survival. I call it justice. I call it overdue." The room wasn't prepared. There were no coughs, no whispered rebuttals, no shifting in seats. Only stillness, as if time had paused to make room for truth. "I'm not trying to burn anything down," she said. "I'm trying to rebuild what was never built right in the first place." Her voice was low, but it carried, cutting through air, through silence, through every unspoken rule that said she was supposed to stay quiet, stay grateful, stay small. Then all at once the room cracked open, a gasp, a murmur. Then it rose, voices, reaction, disbelief, even awe. Someone in the gallery said aloud, "She said that." Another whispered, "That's history." On the other side of the aisle, even a few of her opponents lowered their eyes, unable or unwilling to look directly at her. But Jasmine stayed still. She didn't smirk. She didn't soak it in. She was focused, because she knew what had just happened. She had said the thing everyone else had tiptoed around for years, and she had said it without raising her voice, without losing her cool. Outside, the internet erupted. Twitter exploded with clips, looping her words over and over. "I'm not extreme. I'm asking for what my ancestors died for." The hashtag Not Extreme appeared on t-shirts, in classroom discussions, in church sermons before the week was over. People shared stories, posted photos of their grandmothers holding voter registration cards, told the world that they too had been called extreme for simply wanting equality. But none of that was what Jasmine was thinking about in that moment. She wasn't aiming for viral. She was aiming for truth, plain, firm, and undeniable. Something that would land not just in headlines but in hearts. Something no one, not even Pam Bondi, could erase. But Pam couldn't take it anymore. Jasmine's calm, her clarity, her refusal to be rattled, it all chipped away at Pam's control until the mask cracked. Her voice came harder this time, no longer polished, no longer coated in courtroom charm. "You know what?" she snapped, standing half out of her chair. "If you hate the way we run this country so much, maybe you should just go back to Africa." The words fell like a gunshot in the chamber, sudden, violent, impossible to take back. For a split second, the entire room froze. Not a breath, not a cough, not a whisper. The cameras instinctively zoomed in on Jasmine. Her face remained still, too still, not from shock, but from something deeper, something ancestral, something volcanic held behind iron discipline. The air thickened, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. People turned, looking from Pam to Jasmine, waiting, some in disbelief, others in dread. A staffer dropped a pen, a congressman's jaw visibly tensed. Even the stenographer paused her keystrokes. What Pam had said wasn't a dog whistle. It was a siren, blaring, blatant, brutal. And everyone in that room knew exactly what had just been said, and exactly what it meant. Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Because what she felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was history. It was every courtroom where she'd been doubted, every hallway where she'd been followed, every dinner where someone asked where she was really from. And now it was here, on record, on camera, live on national television. Pam hadn't just insulted her. She had tried to erase her Americanness, erase her belonging, erase her right to even sit in that chair and speak. And Jasmine, she didn't rise to the bait. She rose to the moment. And just when it felt like the weight of history, insult, and silence might crush the room, Jasmine moved. Not with anger, not with haste, but with intention. She rose from her chair like the ground itself had invited her upward. Her movements were slow, steady, but unmistakable, like someone who knew exactly where she stood and exactly why it mattered. She didn't look around for permission. She didn't need it. Every step she took toward the center of that room felt like it was dragging centuries with it. The sound of her heels echoed against marble. Not loud, but sharp, like a gavel striking once and not needing to strike again. All eyes were on her, not because she demanded them, but because something in the room had shifted. Even the air seemed to wait. Then with a voice so steady it cut through the tension like a clean blade, she began. "I was born in Texas," she said, her voice warm but firm, each word pronounced with care. "My father served this country in uniform. My mother served in its hospitals. We didn't ask for special treatment. We worked. We served. We gave. And my ancestors?" She paused just long enough to let their presence fill the room through her. "They were chained, stolen, bought and sold, shipped across an ocean in darkness and fear to build this country brick by brick, field by field. Not because they wanted to, because they were forced to." Her eyes locked onto Pam's, but her words were for everyone. "You say I should go back to Africa?" she repeated, this time not as a question, but as a mirror. "My people were here long before your people ever called this land home. We were here before your family got their piece of the American dream. Ours paid for it in blood. Our backs bent to build cities we were never allowed to live freely in. Our hands grew crops we were never allowed to eat at the same table with. And even now, when we sit in the same rooms, wear the same suits, hold the same titles, you still tell us to leave." Her voice was calm, but the pain beneath it was real and raw and relentless. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, louder now but still clear. "I'm not backing down, and I'm not here to make you comfortable with a past you've chosen to forget. I am here because they never got to be. I am speaking because they were silenced. I am standing because they were told to sit. I am rising because they were crushed underfoot and told to crawl." She stepped closer to the heart of the room. "So no, I will not go back. But if anyone here is trying to take us backward, you will be the one to step aside." And then came the moment. Not an eruption, not a planned ovation, just one person clapping, slow, steady, then another, then another. It moved like a wave made of realization, not noise. It wasn't about agreeing with her politics. It was about recognizing her truth. Even a few lawmakers on Pam's side, those who had stayed stiff and silent until now, clapped softly, almost reluctantly. But they did. The sound filled the room, not loud, but undeniable. Jasmine didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just stood there, tall, centered, grounded, not as someone demanding attention, but as someone who had simply claimed what was already hers. A place in the room, a voice in the conversation, and a name in the story that no one would ever be able to erase again. And just as the echoes of Jasmine's final words settled into the marble floor, something unexpected happened. It didn't come from the front of the room or from behind a microphone. It came from the back, quiet at first, but unmistakably firm. A man stood up slowly, knees stiff, one hand gripping the back of the chair in front of him for balance. He was older, maybe in his late 60s. White. His faded service cap told you what he'd survived. His face told you what he'd regretted. "I used to think like Pam," he said, loud enough for every ear in the room. The chamber turned toward him. "I really did. I used to hear voices like hers." He gestured gently toward Jasmine. "And I thought, there they go again, making everything about race, about the past, about pain." His voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with truth. "I served this country. I believed in this country. But somewhere along the way, I confused comfort with patriotism. I thought that being honest about our history meant hating who we are." He looked directly at Jasmine. "But today, I saw something different." He straightened a little, hand now steady. "People like her aren't tearing this country down. They're holding it up. They're carrying weight that we refuse to name." He paused. "She's not the problem. She's the proof we still have a chance to get this right." The room didn't erupt. It breathed, like a lung that hadn't known it was tight until it finally let go. But the shift wasn't over. A second voice rose, gentler but no less resolute. A woman stood a few rows over, Her shoulders were hunched, hair tied in a messy bun, glasses slipping down her nose. She clutched a canvas tote bag full of handouts, red pens, and a half-eaten granola bar. A teacher, and you could tell by her tone, equal parts tired and passionate. "I teach high school government," she said, her voice wavering just enough to be real. "Next week, we're covering the civil rights movement. I had a lesson plan ready." She held up her phone, the live hearing still streaming on the screen. "But now, this is the lesson, not the insult, the answer, the way she stood there, the way she didn't run. My students are going to see that, because this is what democracy actually looks like: messy, painful, unflinching, and brave." People weren't clapping now because it was expected. They were clapping because they needed to, because something had shifted. The hearing had started as a debate, a performance, a policy exercise. But now it was something else, something human. Jasmine hadn't just changed minds. She'd cracked something open, something raw, long buried, hard to name. And suddenly it wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever watched something wrong happen and stayed quiet, and everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stood anyway. And as the chamber slowly returned to a fragile sense of order, the fire Jasmine had lit didn't fade. It ignited something far beyond those walls. What happened in that room didn't stay in Washington. It traveled, fast, raw, and unfiltered. Within minutes, clips of Pam Bondi's words were everywhere. News anchors couldn't look away. Social media couldn't stop replaying it. And the public? They didn't just react, they responded. By mid-afternoon, the switchboards at the Capitol were overwhelmed. Phones rang off the hook, voicemail boxes filled. Aides at congressional offices, some still in shock themselves, sat frozen as one call came after another, each one angrier and clearer than the last. "I'm a Republican, and I've never heard anything so disgraceful," one caller said. "She crossed a line that can't be uncrossed," said another. "My daughter heard that live on TV," a mother choked through tears, "and asked me why someone in government was allowed to say something like that." What had once been a talking point was now a national reckoning. Emails poured in by the thousands. Petition sites crashed from overuse. Twitter flooded with calls for immediate censure. Hashtags like "disqualify Bondi," "she must resign," and "no seat for hate" trended globally. People weren't just angry, they were activated. Former constituents, war veterans, clergy members, teachers, even retired judges signed open letters demanding her removal from the ethics committee, from the floor, from public service altogether. "This is not a partisan issue," one letter read. "This is a moral one." Inside the Capitol, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Congressional leaders, some of whom had remained quiet during the hearing, began holding closed-door meetings. Staffers whispered in hallways, trading numbers, counting votes, checking procedures. Pam Bondi, once smug in her seat, now sat alone, dodging questions, her usual media allies growing distant. The story was no longer about voter laws. It was about her words, her character, her place in power. Because the truth had landed and the people had heard it, and they weren't just watching anymore. They were calling. They were marching. They were demanding something this country had far too often failed to deliver: real consequences for real harm. And as the phones kept ringing and the outrage turned into action, one moment, just 65 seconds long, began to rise above the noise. It was the clip, the now iconic clip. Jasmine Crockett standing tall, eyes steady, voice unwavering, speaking not just for herself but for generations behind her. No background music, no edits, just one camera, one microphone, and a truth too powerful to ignore. At first it spread slowly, retweeted by activists, reshared by educators, clipped into Instagram reels and TikTok duets. But within hours it was everywhere. CNN called it "the moment America stopped scrolling." A commentator on MSNBC wiped away tears and whispered, "That's what courage looks like." On YouTube, someone overlaid Jasmine's words with the caption, "Grace and fire, power and truth." That phrase stuck. People started writing it on signs, printing it on t-shirts, painting it on murals. It wasn't just a quote, it was a declaration. Then came the comparisons. Historians, journalists, even members of Congress began calling it a modern-day Rosa Parks moment, not because Jasmine sat down, but because she stood up. Not because she was loud, but because she was unshakable. Like Parks, Jasmine hadn't come to make a scene. She had come to tell the truth, and that alone became a revolution. She didn't yell. She didn't insult. She simply stood her ground, in full view of a nation that had too often looked away. And somehow in that stillness, in that control, she flipped the script, turning a moment of deep injustice into one of undeniable strength. Late-night hosts quoted her. Editorials were written about her tone, her posture, the restraint she showed in the face of open hatred. But for the people watching, really watching, none of that was performance. It was survival. It was power in its purest, most undeniable form. And that's why the clip kept growing. Because it didn't just show a woman defending herself, it showed a nation being forced to look in the mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw, but they saw it anyway. Jasmine made sure of that. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth delivered in a voice so steady, it shook the ground. But while Jasmine's truth echoed from classrooms to newsrooms to dinner tables across the country, on the other side of that impact, Pam Bondi disappeared. The woman who once walked into every hearing with cameras trailing her heels, who knew exactly how to tilt her chin for a quote and smile for the headlines, was suddenly gone. No press conferences, no interviews, not even a tweet. When reporters called her office, they were told she wasn't available. When they waited outside committee chambers, she slipped out back doors. When they reached out to her former allies for comment, the silence was even louder. The energy that had once surrounded her, forceful, smug, unshakable, had collapsed into something brittle, fragile. Her name was still in the news, but no longer in the way she had built her career around. It wasn't admiration, it was accountability. And the shift didn't stop with the press. It crept into the hallways of power, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Lawmakers who once praised her behind podiums now avoided walking next to her on the floor. Strategic distancing. Not one statement, but 100 tiny signals. A seat unfilled at a closed-door meeting, a name missing from a co-sponsored bill, a social media post quietly deleted. Pam Bondi had become toxic, and no one wanted the splash to reach them. A senior Republican aide, speaking anonymously, told a reporter, "We're not going down with her. What she said crossed a line we can't spin away." Inside her own party, some whispered about damage control, others talked openly about ethics reviews, and a few, more candid than cautious, admitted what had already become clear. Pam wasn't the victim. She wasn't the brave voice anymore. She was the warning, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is mistaken for permission. And now, in the aftermath of Jasmine's courage, Pam found herself in a place she had never expected to be. Alone, avoided, and no longer untouchable. And as the noise outside Capitol Hill began to soften, from the protests, the headlines, the calls for accountability, Jasmine returned to her office, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to breathe. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in hours, there was no one else in the room. No cameras, no staffers, no microphones, just her, just the quiet. She walked slowly past the desk, the warmth of the late afternoon sun spilling across the carpet, casting long golden lines through the blinds. Her heels finally stopped beside the window, where the city's silhouette rose in sharp contrast to the rawness of what had just unfolded. Washington buzzed on as always, but something had shifted, and she could feel it, not in the headlines, but in her chest. Something different, something earned. She let herself sink into the chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders like memory. She rested her forearms on the armrests, then leaned back, eyes fixed on nothing in particular outside. Just the moving shapes of traffic, people walking past, some of whom might have just watched her speak and didn't even realize who they were passing by. That was the truth of public service. It was both historic and invisible at the same time. She had stood in a room built by men who never imagined her standing there. And today she hadn't just spoken, she had endured. And now in this stillness came the silence that followed not fear, but impact. That's when she saw it. A folded piece of paper on her desk. Not typed, not labeled, just carefully placed. Handwritten. The kind of thing no one sends anymore. Curious, she reached for it. The penmanship was shaky but deliberate, the ink slightly smudged in the corners. It wasn't long, just 5 short lines. But every word felt heavier than the hours she'd just lived. Dear Congresswoman Crockett, I've disagreed with almost everything you've stood for. But today, I watched you stand for something bigger than politics. And for the first time, I respected you. Truly. Thank you for not backing down. No signature, just the words. No address, just impact. She read it once, then again, slower the second time. Not because she needed to, but because some truths deserve to be heard more than once. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the page. Her eyes, just moments ago, sharp with steel, now softened. Not from weakness, but from release. And then she smiled. Not the kind she gave in front of cameras, not the one she used to hold composure on the house floor, but a real one. Quiet, warm, the kind that didn't need to be seen to matter. She looked back out the window, this time not at the movement, but at the stillness between the moments. Maybe change doesn't come from shouting, she whispered to herself. Maybe it comes from a voice that doesn't shake, even when it should. She said it not for effect, not for drama, but as a reminder. A note to self, a promise kept. Behind her the phones buzzed, emails dinged. Her staff would return soon. There would be follow-ups, interviews, debates. More rooms to enter, more truths to carry. The world wouldn't slow down just because she had made it stop for a moment. But right now in this room, she had space to feel what so many never get the chance to feel after speaking out, peace. She folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and tucked it into the top drawer of her desk, where she kept only a few things. A photo of her grandmother, a worn-out pocket constitution, and now this letter. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a sentence, handwritten, left on a desk by someone who once stood on the other side of the line and decided to cross it. Not for her, but because of her. And that was enough. But as Jasmine placed the letter into the drawer and let the moment settle in her chest, the world outside her window didn't slow down. It sharpened its claws. By the next morning, the headlines had split in two. On one side were those calling her a voice of moral clarity, a figure of courage, a woman who had drawn a line and dared the nation to see it. But on the other side, fueled by fear, resentment, and an empire of outrage, the backlash had begun. It started with talk radio. One host referred to her as a leftist soldier in a race war. Another called her performative, accusing her of scripted victimhood. But that was just the beginning. By noon, digital outlets on the far-right fringe had crafted headlines that were part smear, part conspiracy. Crockett melts down on House floor. Is she fit to lead? Why are Democrats letting race-baiting replace debate? Jasmine Crockett's real agenda. Power by division. Clips of her speech were edited down, stripped of context. Her voice slowed slightly to sound more aggressive. A still frame of her mid-sentence, eyes focused, was captured and captioned. Anger, not leadership. That image made the rounds on meme pages and message boards that prided themselves on anonymity and venom. Then came the coordinated wave. Fake accounts flooded her social media with insults, dog whistles, and thinly veiled threats. Some messages were subtle. You're not helping your cause, while others were violent, graphic, and cruel. Her staff logged and reported what they could. Capitol Police were notified. Security protocols were updated, but Jasmine remained calm. Not numb, but practiced. Because when you grow up black and bold in America, you learn to read hate in high resolution. This wasn't new, but it was louder now, faster, algorithmic. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, shoes off, blazer draped over the back of a chair, takeout container half-eaten, her phone buzzed again. Another message. This one read, "You should have stayed in your lane. You brought this on yourself." She stared at it for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Then she turned the phone face down, not because she was ignoring it, but because it didn't deserve her attention. Still, the weight was real, not just for her, but for her team. One aide, young, idealistic, only a year out of college, broke down after deleting her fifth death threat from the office inbox. Jasmine put a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Don't let the bark shake you. Their fear is loud because their time is running out." It wasn't a pep talk. It was armor. Shared, not spoken. What stung the most wasn't the trolls. It was the silence. Some of her colleagues, people who had once called her brave in private, who had sent text messages after her speech saying, "I'm proud of you," had now gone quiet in public. No tweets, no press statements, no retweets. They were waiting to see where the wind would blow before they raised their flags. The real test, Jasmine knew, was never about the moment itself. It was about what came next. Would people stand by the truth when it was no longer trending? Would they speak when it might cost them? Or would they wait for the fire to die down before stepping back into the light? A well-known cable anchor aired a segment titled "The Crockett Conundrum," posing the question, is her brand of politics inspiring or incendiary? The panel was split. One guest called her necessary, another called her divisive. No one mentioned what had been said to her. No one played Pam Bondi's words. That was the pattern. People dissected Jasmine's tone, her timing, her posture, but not the provocation that came before it. They measured her response like it was a weapon, but treated the insult like a whisper. And that, more than anything, was the old game repackaged again. Hold the oppressed to the standard of saints while letting the powerful fall short without consequence. In the middle of that week, Jasmine received an internal memo. It came from her party's communications office. It suggested that in upcoming appearances, she pivot focus back toward legislative goals and lower emotional intensity to maintain message discipline. She read it in silence, then circled one line in red pen and wrote in the margin, "The only thing I lowered was my voice, and it scared them louder than a scream ever could." She never sent the note back, but she left it on her desk where anyone walking in could read it. That same day, she received a hand-delivered envelope. No return address. Inside was a printout of a social media post, someone calling her a race hustler and the real racist. Taped to it was a sticky note that read simply, "You made them uncomfortable. Good, keep going." It wasn't signed, but she recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a senior aide from another office, a white woman, a quiet ally, another crack in the wall. And the truth was, the backlash meant it had landed. You don't get that kind of resistance unless you hit something real. Jasmine knew it. Her team knew it. Even her critics, deep down, knew it. That's why they were scrambling, not to stop her, but to contain what she had already started. One night she returned to her office after hours, the building nearly empty. She turned on the lamp, opened her laptop, and watched the clip again, not for validation, but to listen, to hear how it sounded without adrenaline in her ears. And there it was, her voice, calm, clear, steady, not perfect, not polished, just true. She leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, and said quietly, "Let them come." Because by then, she had understood something unshakable. The backlash is the proof. The silence is the confession. And the fire? The fire means you're getting close to the heart of something they don't want to face. And Jasmine Crockett had no intention of turning back now. And while the backlash grew louder, more coordinated, and at times almost cruel in its precision, something else was happening. Something quieter, slower, and far more surprising. Not everyone raised their fists. Some people lowered their walls. They didn't post about it. They didn't send donations. They didn't craft long threads on social media. They just paused. They listened. And in that silence, something began to shift. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but beyond the anger, beyond the headlines, people were watching her, not to attack, but to learn. It began with a letter, typed, folded, left at the front desk of her office without a name. "I work down the hall. I've disagreed with you on nearly every vote, but I watched the hearing, I listened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw someone speak without calculation. You didn't flinch, you didn't insult, you just told the truth. I think I needed to hear that more than I realized. Thank you. That same day, Jasmine received a text message from a Republican colleague. Not a friend, not even an ally. Just someone she'd nodded to in passing a dozen times on the floor. The message was brief. I don't agree with everything, but what she said to you was disgusting. If you ever need someone to walk with you through the tunnel, I will. She stared at that text for a long moment, not because it erased anything, but because it meant something had pierced the armor. Not publicly, not loudly, but honestly. Then came the hallway moments. Elevator rides that once sat in silence now filled with awkward greetings. Quick glances, a hesitant, that was something, from a lawmaker who had once brushed past her without eye contact. It was subtle, but it was happening. And then, unexpectedly, came an invitation. An older congressman, known for being deeply conservative, approached her after a committee meeting. His face was hard to read. His voice was quiet. I'd like to grab coffee sometime, he said. No cameras. Just a conversation. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, unsure. He noticed. I won't try to change your mind, he added, but maybe I need to change mine. They met 2 days later in a back booth at the Rayburn cafeteria. No staff, no press, just black coffee and space to speak. At first the conversation was stiff, policy lines, old grievances, but then, somewhere between stories of his Alabama childhood and Jasmine sharing how her father used to walk 3 miles to vote, something opened. He leaned in and said, You know, I used to think people who talked about systemic injustice were just making excuses. But when I heard you talk about your ancestors, about not leaving, I don't know. Something about that made it real. I'm not saying I get it all, but I'm trying. Jasmine nodded slowly. She didn't offer a victory smile. She just said, That's all anyone's ever asked for. That you try. He didn't switch parties. He didn't make a speech. But 2 weeks later, when a bill came up about restoring federal protections to polling locations, he broke ranks and voted yes. The press didn't link it to her, but she knew. These moments began adding up, in the most unexpected places. One evening, after a long floor session, a janitor knocked gently on her office door. He held a broom in one hand and a small folded napkin in the other. On the napkin, written in shaky blue ink, were 5 words, You speak for my mother. He didn't wait for a response, just tipped his cap and moved on. Another time, at a town hall in rural Arkansas, where Jasmine had been invited to speak about voting access, a man in a flannel shirt and dusty boots stood up during Q&A. His accent was thick, his arms were crossed. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But when he finally spoke, he said, My granddaddy told me government ain't for us, that it's just for rich folks and people on TV. But I watched that video of you, and for the first time, I felt like someone in that building actually saw us. Jasmine stood a little straighter. I see you, she said, but more importantly, I need you to see yourself in it too. The applause wasn't wild. It was steady, sincere. And yet none of this made headlines. Cable news didn't run features on quiet Republicans voting their conscience. Twitter didn't trend for someone saying, maybe I was wrong. But Jasmine felt it, every day, in the way people looked at her, in the letters that came not with money, but with memories. From daughters telling her their fathers, former police officers, lifelong conservatives, had started asking better questions at the dinner table. From pastors in the Midwest who replaced this week's sermon with her speech and a prayer. This wasn't a revolution with marches and bullhorns. It was a rethinking, a reweaving of what had long been torn. And Jasmine, through steadiness, not spectacle, had become a thread pulling it together. One afternoon, a teacher from Nebraska sent an email. No subject line, just this. Every year I teach about Rosa Parks. This year, my students asked me why we don't talk about the people still doing that kind of work. I showed them your hearing, then I asked them what they saw. One girl said, She didn't even yell. She just stood there like a wall that wouldn't fall. Jasmine forwarded the message to her chief of staff with one note. We don't need everyone. Just enough to break the cycle. Because that's what these quiet allies were doing. Not flipping sides, but flipping perspectives. They weren't becoming Democrats. They were becoming listeners. And that, Jasmine believed, was where real change begins. Not with shouting, not with winning, but with someone who used to look away, choosing instead to lean in. The drawer didn't creak. It simply opened, like it had been waiting. Late on a Thursday evening, long after the last votes had been cast, long after the press pool had filed out, and the building had gone still, Jasmine returned to her office. The air was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It never really was. The echoes of the week still lingered. Every insult, every standing ovation, every awkward handshake from someone who used to pretend she didn't exist. She dropped her keys on the desk, slipped off her heels, and exhaled. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something heavier. The kind of fatigue that doesn't come from walking or working, but from carrying the weight of being first. The weight of knowing that your composure is political, your breath is scrutinized, your voice, when steady, makes people uncomfortable, and when raised, makes them afraid. Her eyes drifted to the top right drawer. Inside were two pieces of paper. Just two. One, a small handwritten note with no signature. The other, an email she had printed on cheap office stock. She hadn't read either in days, but she hadn't stopped thinking about them. These weren't fan letters. They weren't filled with praise. They were quiet, uncertain, and deeply human. And Jasmine understood that those were the voices that mattered most. Not the loudest, but the ones who had to cross something in themselves just to speak. She reached for the handle again, but before she could open it, her chief of staff poked her head in. "You've got mail," she said, a soft grin on her face. "Like actual mail, from the post office. Handwritten." She handed over a thick envelope, sealed with care, slightly creased like it had traveled far. No return address, no staff stamps. Just her name in neat cursive. Representative Jasmine Crockett, United States Capitol, Washington, D.C. She sat back down, turned the envelope in her hands, and slid a letter opener beneath the seal. Inside was a sheet of off-white paper, lined with deep blue ink. The writing was careful, almost formal, the kind of penmanship that told you the writer grew up in a different America. She began to read. "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, you don't know me, you may never meet me, but I've known your face since the moment you spoke, and I haven't been able to forget it. I'm a veteran of the Korean War. I served in 1952. I came home to a different world, tried to live quietly and raised my children the best I could. I voted Republican for over 50 years. I've seen movements come and go. I've seen protests, riots, speeches, elections, and I've disagreed with many people who look and sound like you. That's the truth. But then you stood in that room, and you didn't yell, you didn't curse, you didn't even raise your voice. You stood there like you belonged, because you do. And you told a truth I had spent my life trying not to hear. When that woman told you to go back to Africa, I sat frozen, not because I agreed with her, but because I had heard those words before, at my dinner table, at my lodge, on the front porch with men I called friends. I never said them myself, but I never stopped them either. I stayed quiet, respectable, cowardly. But then something strange happened. My granddaughter was watching that hearing with me, 11 years old, bright eyes, big questions. She turned to me afterward and asked, "Grandpa, would you protect her if someone tried to hurt her?" I said yes, and I meant it. I've watched that clip 27 times since. I don't agree with every word you say, but I now understand why you say them, and I want you to know, something in me cracked open that day. Not broken, opened. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for a country I told myself I loved, but never fully understood. Thank you for standing when others sat, for speaking when silence would have been safer, for being exactly who you are. With respect, Howard G. Pensacola. Florida Jasmine read the letter all the way through once, then again slower. She didn't cry. She didn't lean back and stare into the ceiling for dramatic effect. She just breathed it in, like oxygen after a long run, like the kind of honesty that rarely makes it into politics, like proof that some things, some people, can change. She folded it slowly, precisely, and placed it into the drawer next to the first. Her fingers rested on the edges for a moment longer. 2 letters, 2 moments, one from a man too ashamed to sign his name, the other from a man who found the courage to try again. The knock on the door came a few minutes later. Her scheduler leaned in. "You're due at Judiciary in 15, she said. "They're calling a review of the Voting Access Amendment." Jasmine nodded. "Got it." She stood, smoothed the fabric of her jacket, and glanced once more at the drawer before closing it with a soft click. As she walked down the hallway toward the chamber, her steps felt a little heavier, but not with burden, with responsibility. Every marble tile underfoot had been laid by someone who never imagined a black woman from Texas would walk them with the law in her hand and the truth on her tongue. Somewhere across the country, a grandfather had turned off cable news and sat his granddaughter down to talk about courage. Somewhere else, a former political opponent was rethinking what leadership meant. And inside the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just walking into another vote. She was walking into the future they had once tried to keep her from entering. And now she wasn't just allowed in, she was leading. And as Jasmine stepped into the committee chamber once more, folder in hand, expression calm, gait unshaken, she wasn't walking in alone. Not really. Behind every step was the echo of names never spoken in that room. Names buried under courthouse bricks, names erased from voting rolls, names who once marched without microphones. She didn't need to say them. She carried them. And though no one could see it, she was never more surrounded. The room quieted as she took her seat. The chair creaked. The microphones blinked red. The hearing resumed. But something about the air was different now. Not tense, not hostile, charged. Not with conflict, but with consequence. Something had changed. Not everything. Not enough. But something. Because every once in a while, a moment cuts through noise like glass through fog. It demands clarity. It forces truth to the surface. Uninvited, unpolished, and undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had stood in one of those moments, and she hadn't just survived it. She had transformed it. The lesson from that day wasn't just about politics. It wasn't just about racism. It wasn't even just about courage. It was about what happens when someone refuses to be small in a room designed to shrink them. For decades, rooms like that had swallowed voices, subcommittees, hearings, testimonies buried under procedure and polite tones. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't weep. She stood, with history in her throat and steel in her spine, and spoke the kind of truth that burns away the masks people wear when they don't want to admit what they really fear. Because what Pam Bondi said wasn't new. It was just televised. What Jasmine answered wasn't rehearsed. It was remembered. This story reminds us that discrimination rarely screams. It whispers, hides behind policy, behind concern, behind civility. And when a black woman like Jasmine challenges it with facts, with presence, with the unshakable audacity of still being here, the system doesn't just push back, it panics, it lashes out. Not because she's wrong, but because she makes it impossible to pretend anymore. Injustice doesn't end when laws are passed. It ends when power no longer fears being held accountable. And in that room, power was forced to look in the mirror, and it flinched. Jasmine Crockett didn't offer America a comfortable message. She offered it a reflection, not of what it pretends to be, but of what it still is in too many rooms, too many laws, too many hearts. And that's why it mattered. Because the truth doesn't need permission, it needs presence. And that day, Jasmine gave it a body, a voice, and a name. She stood not to win an argument, but to reclaim the right to even speak without apology. And in doing so, she taught a nation the difference between silence and peace. Because silence is what happens when people are afraid. Peace is what happens when people are free. The aftermath of her speech wasn't just viral, it was vital. In a classroom in Detroit, a student raised her hand for the first time and said, "I want to run for something." In a church in Mississippi, a pastor rewrote his sermon, starting with, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to leave. In a VFW hall in Kansas, a veteran who hadn't voted since '84 registered again, writing in the remarks, "Because she reminded me why it still matters." Across the country, Jasmine's story was dissected, celebrated, criticized, but more importantly, it was felt. It made people ask questions, hard ones, personal ones. It made some people uncomfortable. It made others brave. And for Jasmine herself, the lesson wasn't in the claps. It wasn't in the coverage. It was in the cost and the choice. Because she knew she could have said nothing. She could have smiled through the insult, moved on, been respectable. But respectability never protected the truth. It just made it easier to ignore. So what is the message of this story? It's this. You don't change a country by being loud. You change it by being clear. Clarity terrifies those who profit from confusion. And Jasmine was clear. Clear about where she stood. Clear about who came before her. Clear that pain isn't a punchline. Clear that identity isn't a threat. Clear that silence, especially when it is expected, is the most powerful battlefield of all. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the exhausted, the overlooked, the ones told to wait your turn in a country built on stolen time. She spoke for the single mother who works 2 jobs and still gets told she's not trying hard enough. For the black father pulled over for driving a car too nice. For the immigrant child who translates eviction notices for their parents before homework. For the girl in the back of the classroom who doesn't raise her hand. Not because she doesn't know the answer, but because she's afraid of how the room will look at her if she does. And maybe most importantly, Jasmine spoke for the people who have never seen anyone like them in a room like that. Until now. This story also reveals a hard truth for those in power. History does not ask for comfort. It demands confrontation. Pam Bondi's words, weaponized with a smile, were not an exception. They were a symptom of a system still rotting at its foundations. But Jasmine's answer wasn't just a clapback. It was a verdict, delivered with restraint, shaped by memory, sharpened by every courtroom where justice was denied because the wrong person dared to ask for it. And when she said, "I'm not going anywhere," she wasn't just talking to Bondi. She was talking to every system, every stare, every silent rule that ever told her to shrink. Her presence was not permission. It was protest. Not the kind that holds a sign, the kind that becomes the sign. And so, if there's one lesson that rises above the rest, it's this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay in the room. Stay when you're insulted. Stay when you're erased. Stay when power dares you to walk out so it doesn't have to answer for itself. Because staying is not weakness. Staying is resistance. And when you stay, when you answer hate with presence, not rage, when you answer dismissal with dignity, you teach the room a lesson that echoes longer than any policy ever will. That truth has roots deeper than fear. That presence is power. That the most powerful revolutions don't start with shouts. They start with someone refusing to sit down. And that day, Jasmine Crockett stood so the rest of us could rise. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.